Continuous improvement comes in lots of different flavors and styles. I'm Bella Engelbach, and I'm inviting you to journey with me to the edges of lean. Episode 134, Continuous Improvement in a Time of Political Turmoil with Phyllis Leavitt. It's election season in the United States, and it is affecting all of us, no matter how involved we are or are not in politics. Deep fractures run through our families, neighborhoods, and workplaces, and they are affecting our ability to live and work with each other. Phyllis Leavitt's new book, America in Therapy, directly addresses this problem and what we can do about it. She joined me at the Edges of Lean to talk about the intersections of political division and continuous improvement. Phyllis Leavitt, welcome to the Edges of Lean.
Well, thank you so much for having me here with you today.
I'm so glad you're here. And this is such an important time for us to have this conversation as we're we are in an intense political season here in the U.S. And I'm sure for those of you who are listening outside the U.S., you are well aware of our election that's coming up in November and some of the challenges that go with it and really what it is that is making it all feel so tense right now and feeling as if we can't talk to each other. Phyllis, I'd love it if you could introduce yourself to us and tell us a little bit about your pathway and how you wrote why you wrote the book that we're going to be talking about.
Yeah, thank you so much. I've been a psychotherapist for well over 30 years, and I also did a lot of therapy myself when I was younger, and that's actually what got me into the field, because understanding myself on a psychological level and what were some of the difficulties in my early years and conditioning from my family and the culture that I lived in, really opening that up and understanding what some of those factors were really helped me make sense of myself in a way that I wasn't able to before, and also to heal from some early trauma. So I became a therapist, and I worked a lot with children and families and individual adults and couples. And out of all of that, working with so many people, sort of like I would say like you and me, but there's a lot of trauma in our culture, and there's a lot of dysfunctional family dynamics that many, many people are struggling to survive and thrive out of and figure themselves out like I did. And it occurred to me that there's traumatized people all over the world who have no access to any help. And not only do they not have any access to help, but they don't even have rescue from what's traumatizing them. People in war zones, people who are suffering extreme poverty and discrimination and persecution for the color of their skin or their religious orientation. And we have that right here at home in the United States. It's not just all over the world somewhere else. It's right here that people are really suffering and become highly symptomatic. And I don't know that that's really common knowledge. I don't know that our basic psychology, what are the effects of healthy family dynamics and what are the effects of dysfunctional and abusive or neglectful family dynamics, I don't know that that's general knowledge. And that's one of the motivations for me writing the book, is that I want to make that general knowledge, because people who are victimized and who don't get help tend to become highly symptomatic. And of course, on a continuum from less severe to very severe. And in our culture, we often blame our victims for their symptoms rather than understanding that if they're really passive and helpless, or if they're really aggressive and dominating or hurtful to other people, if they're highly addicted, deeply depressed, become very rigid and righteous, that sometimes these are symptoms of dysfunctional family dynamics. So that was one piece. And then the other big piece that really motivated me to write the book was from so many years working with families, and the whole culture of psychotherapy today looks at family conditioning. We don't see people as islands. You're not just born good or bad, depressed or anxious. There's usually many factors in our growing up that, even though we're all born with our own natural tendencies, and people are definitely born with different natural tendencies. We're also highly susceptible to the elements in our conditioning. And those family dynamics that we grew up with operate everywhere. Family dynamics operate in the workplace, they operate in school systems, they operate in any group of people that are functioning together, and they operate on the highest levels of government and our greatest and most powerful institutions. And so healthy family dynamics can operate in a business, or very dysfunctional family dynamics can operate in a business, for example. So I took the lens of what I'm calling abuse family dynamics and healthy family dynamics, and looking at our country through that lens. What are the dynamics that are coming down from the top that we're advocating as individuals that are actually abusive or neglectful dynamics that are hurting untold numbers of people who are becoming symptomatic within our country? And everything I'm saying applies around the world, but I'm just talking about America.
America.
And then
Yeah.
what do we know from the world of psychology that helps interrupt that cycle of abuse and neglect and helps people heal? And could we bring that to national conversation? Because my feeling is that it's urgent that we do. And when we're talking about what's going on in politics today, some of the dynamics that we see playing out all over the social media, headlines in the news, are terrible ways of relating to other people, and they don't provide the context for actually working out our differences. So that's it in a nutshell.
That's it. And that's the whole thing. So wow, there's a lot there, Phyllis. So can we just rewind a bit? So you talked a little bit about some of the, I guess you say, the symptoms of people who have dealt with bad family dynamics, and so that you mentioned apathy, suppression, anger. How do these play out in the workplace? I mean, what do we see in the workplace when somebody is experiencing those?
Well, it's very interesting that you asked that question, because I've had a number of clients over the years who've come to therapy specifically because they were suffering in their workplace. And
Mm.
what I have seen is that we tend to play out the roles that we learned early on wherever we go. So if in your family you learned that the only way to survive was to shut up and withdraw and try to become invisible, chances are, without a chance to heal or without exposure to very different helpful role models, we're going to play out those same roles in our workplace. So, and someone who learned to survive in a dysfunctional family by becoming aggressive and forcing their way on other people, or needing to be top dog because they were so afraid of being hurt, is likely to play out that role in the workplace. And so I've had people come to therapy more often than not. It's not the aggressor who comes to therapy. I will say that. It's more often not. It's the person who has been silenced, the person who's frightened, the person who has become more pleasing or just driven always to be perfect in order to find a way to survive and thrive. And so often what I've seen is that people come to therapy and they can't find their voice, or they have a boss that never recognizes their hard work. They can't get a promotion because the competitive atmosphere is actually repressive.
Yeah.
Place. Or they go for help to HR and they can't get it because HR is an arm of of the
Of
higher
management. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, which is just like what happens in a family where there's dysfunction. A child tries to tell somebody and they're not believed, or they're punished worse for telling what happened. And this is happening in our society at large. Peaceful demonstrators are being tear gassed. People who are calling out for justice are maligned, and they're often killed. So we have these same dysfunctional family dynamics, abusive family dynamics happening in our homes, and not in every home, in our businesses and not in every business, in our schools, in our sometimes in places of worship, and in the larger institutions that run our government. There's policies and practices that really hurt thousands and thousands of people and keep them in a position of powerlessness or a position where they can't fight back against aggression and injustice. And we have to know that when people become symptomatic in a family, and I'll tell you this from having worked with so many children, but this goes for adults as well. But I started out working just primarily with children. Nearly every child that was brought to therapy that I saw for symptoms like wetting the bed, having excessive fears, not being able to make friends, regressing and talking baby talk, attacking other children, being like the bully on the playground or being easily bullied on the playground, or failure to thrive in school. These were some of the symptoms that were presented. Nothing was wrong with any of these children. They were suffering from conflict and violence and dysfunction in their home. And often what they were suffering from was a highly conflictual, unresolved divorce between their parents. So, and they were the symptom bearers. The child was the one who was brought to therapy for their symptoms. And in the world of psychology, we know this dynamic really well, and they're called the identified patient. They're the one who becomes the most symptomatic to signal that the family is in trouble. And if we just take that model and we apply it to our country, what do we think mass shooters are? What do we think the people are who are exploiting the elderly or jacking up their prices and gouging the market or scamming people or people who are out there, committing rape and in all kinds of horrible behaviors that we consider criminal, and they are, and they're very dangerous. But these people are also the symptom bearers for the ills in the family of America. And they're called.
And we don't even sort of give them that title as the identified patient, right? That they are viewed as being, well, they're the boss, or they're the governor, or they are the, whatever it is. They're actually, in some cases, receive adulation and praise, and people who surround them supporting their behavior.
That's absolutely true. And one of the many things I talk about is sometimes people who have identified with the aggressor as a way to survive seek positions of great power and influence where they can continue to dominate. And one of the things that I just really, really want to emphasize on a psychological level that I think many people are not consciously aware of, although I think it makes perfect sense, is that when someone is an abuser, let's just say in a family, but it could be in any setting, when someone has abusive, repressive, hateful, or violent tendencies, it comes from some wound that they have in terms of love and belonging. Love and belonging are what help people be healthy in their relationships. Love, belonging, cooperation, safety, being provided for, and an atmosphere that is committed to nonviolence, nonviolent communication, nonviolent conflict resolution. And when people don't have that, some people will identify with the aggressor. So, but what happens, whether you're an aggressor or you become really passive and easily dominated, is that the bonds of love and connection have been injured or broken. Abuse breaks our bonds of love and connection and compassion and care, because abuse can't happen in an environment where there's compassion and care and not a commitment to nonviolence, and where everyone is welcomed and wanted and valued. There's no abuse in that kind of environment, which is more or less a healthy family environment, given that none of us are perfect. So abuse comes from the broken bonds of love and care, and it perpetuates the broken bonds of love and care. So when you have a society that has a lot of abuse and neglect going on in it, and I'm not saying that that's all that's going on in America, there are amazing, wonderful people doing incredible service to other human beings here. But to the extent that we have abuse and neglect on a large situation, we're perpetuating these broken bonds of love and care. And when you don't love and you don't care and you don't value other human beings, it's easier to hurt them. It's easier to exploit them. And that's how this cycle of trauma continues.
There's so much for us to think about then, think about the work that the listeners of this show do. of being in an organization, knowing that, as you come into the organization, you have your own self to know, and your own, perhaps past trauma, and
Right.
I would say almost everyone. I can't imagine anyone growing up in a completely, well-functioning family, and also having been to a school that's 100% well-functioning, and having
Right.
had jobs with colleagues and managers who are also well-functioning. So I would imagine that almost everyone has had at least some taste or a view
Sure.
on that behavior, right? So we're all coming in there. We need to and I love what you say. We need to understand ourselves and have done the work to understand ourselves. But then we're looking at other people. We want to encourage them to do certain things at work. I want this person to speak up, or I want this person to be less aggressive. And I think that's where we, as leaders and as coaches, and we talk about this a lot on the show, we have to realize at some point we're not skilled in doing that, right? That's the skill for doing that really is a therapeutic skill, and that there are times where we're not going to be able to do that. But I'm sure, Phyllis, there are things that we can learn to do, both for ourselves and for other people, that can, be maybe band-aids, maybe things that just help create a better environment so people can heal and grow.
Yeah, and I've worked with both sides. I mean, I would say more commonly, I've worked with someone who's feeling oppressed in the workplace.
Mm-hmm.
But I've also worked with a few people who, when they did their own healing work, and they didn't come in to talk about the workplace, but when they came in to work on their own wounding from childhood that was really impairing their life, and they were able to get in touch with that child in them who had adapted in some non-functional way because it was the best they could come up with. I mean, we really do the best we can as kids to try to survive. So if you survived by being more aggressive, or if you survived by being a people pleaser, or if you survived by withdrawing, you did the best you could. But usually those coping mechanisms, especially on the extreme end, don't work later on in life to get us the kind of relationships and cooperation with others and feeling of belonging from others that we want. So I've worked with a few people who, when they dealt with their own childhood wounds, actually found themselves spontaneously, not with me even bringing it up, realizing that the way they were treating people in the workplace mirrored the way they had been treated as children. And they were able to change that and influence the work environment in a very positive way, be more relational, be more caring toward the people they worked with or the people that worked for them, and be more recognizing of other people's strengths and affirming them rather than either ignoring them or being in competition with them or in some other way of not being a really helpful colleague. So it can work both ways. It can work and I've worked with lots of people who have stood up for themselves in a different way as a result of doing their own healing work, who have quit jobs where they felt that they were really being mistreated, or stood up for themselves in a way that was appropriate and spoke out. So any and all are possible. And again, we take that and we just expand that to the nation. And we need to be able to speak out. We need to be able to call for justice, or call out untruth, or call out abusive behavior, or discrimination. And we need to be able to do that safely, whether it's in our home, in our business, in our school, in our church, or in our communities and in our government. And that's part of mental health. And so one of the big arguments of my book and my work is that the beauty of psychology and the contribution that really has not been allowed to be fully made of psychology to our whole culture and our political system is that psychology is not partisan. It's not, the goal is not to decide who's right and who's wrong. The goal is to help people sit down and listen deeply to one another the way they want to be heard, for the purpose of resolving their conflicts and their differences. And we're not seeing this mirrored in a really big way in our government, in many instances in our government today. And it's having an effect on the whole family of America, just like warring parents have a terrible effect on their children, as I talked about earlier. And I think many, many people are feeling really stressed about what's happening at the highest levels of authority. And it's like we're in, a highly conflictual family that we can't get out of. And what do we do?
Right. Right, right. And we're being asked right now, are we going to pick between the parents, right? Which parent do you want to go with, right? And yeah, it is really hard. Well, one of the things that I see a lot, I have seen a lot, and is that these conversations have become shorthand conversations. That people, whether it's they're sharing memes or they are, sharing, quotes from people, or they're using certain catchphrases, the
Right.
conversations where we do have a conversation, they become not real conversations. And so I'll take it as an example, something from my own family, which is that there is a deep conflict in my own family, a political conflict, and there are people who are not talking to each other. If they do talk to each other, they don't say anything about politics because they
Right.
can't talk about politics. But when they talk about politics, they're not talking about meaning. They're talking about these sort of catchphrases or these code words for something else. And I was wondering, how do we move beyond that, beyond those kind of conversations? So I'll give you an example. So let's take immigration for example. So one group of people will look at immigrants who have come into the country without going through the normal channels. They will not call them immigrants; they call them illegals. And when somebody says illegal, there's a whole set of images that come into mind or are actually being shared about who or what these people are. They're, whether they're dangerous, they're criminals, whatever it is, they're illegals. And then on the other side, people say, well, they're undocumented, right? So, sounds factual, but when people say undocumented, they're also meaning a whole lot of other meanings that they're not saying. So one side's talking about illegals, the other side's talking about undocumented people, but we're not talking to each other. We're talking past each other. Does that
Well,
make sense?
yeah, and I think there's many angles to talk about that from. One of them is that nothing in human relations is that black and white. And I think it's kind of a very superficial and somewhat, and I don't mean this maligning anybody, but it's a
Yeah.
kind of immature way of approaching looking at people to just put a blanket label on a whole set of individuals who have individual histories, who have individual traumas, who came here from different places for different reasons, many of them fleeing for their lives, fleeing for their children's lives. And so to just put a blanket label on people dismisses their humanity. And I think that is one of the terrible things that happens in a dysfunctional family system, that people are just labeled and they're no longer individuals with stories. And I could just tell you so many things about so that's one angle, that it really takes away the individual humanity of people. And that's one of the ways that makes it easy to inflict pain on them or not treat them as we would want to be treated ourselves. And that's one of the reasons why I say we're really suffering. It's not an ideological divide that we're really suffering from. It's being presented that way because that cements the division. But what we're
Yeah.
really suffering from is mental unwellness, because mentally fit and healthy people don't put blanket labels on other people. They care about the humanity of an individual. And one of the things that good therapy does is really go into our history. How did we get there? How did hundreds of thousands of people want to cross the borders and come into the United States? Most people don't want to leave their homes. They don't want to leave their families. They don't want to leave their culture unless it's unviable for them to stay there. I don't want to leave my home.
Right.
Nothing would make me leave my home unless I was in danger, in great danger. If I couldn't eat, if I was afraid of being killed, if I was afraid of my country being overrun. So I think we have to know that in the family of the world that we're a part of and that we influence and that we have impacted as one of the most powerful nations in the world, that we have something to do with why many people are fleeing over our borders. Are we totally responsible? No, but we have something to do with it. And many of us, many of us, many more of us than not, are the descendants of immigrants ourselves who were also fleeing poverty and war and religious persecution, as well as people who came here, to seek their fortune. But I'm totally the product of an immigrant population that came here in the early 1900s, and many people go way, way, way back. But we're
Yeah,
immigrants, and so how have we made this separation between ourselves and our ancestors and people fleeing hunger and war and hatred all over the world? And that's not saying we should just open our borders and have no way to protect and preserve our own culture, but I think we have to see people as people, and labels really take that away. So
so is
that's
there
one.
a way, Phyllis? I love what you're saying. Is there a way when you're talking to somebody, and I'm just using this as an example, and talking to somebody, and they are, for them, that label illegal is what's in their mind. There's a lot of fear associated with it. There may be racism associated with it
Right.
that they may not even be aware of, right? Because racism can be so deeply ingrained in us. And so is there a way to start to have a conversation with that person that helps? I mean, it's not like somebody's right and somebody's wrong, but helps move to a more human way of looking at this situation. And I think you said something that to me might be a key. It might be about stories, right? It might be about hearing stories or um,
Totally. Totally. And that's one of the beauties of the best psychotherapy. But let me just say, you don't have to be a therapist to do
yeah,
many of the things that I'm talking about. This is just a way of treating other human beings that we can all learn to be more compassionate and better listeners. Everybody has a story. Everybody has a story. And that's one of the gifts of the best psychology and psychotherapy, is that we listen to that story. So I'll tell you, something that I think really relates to what you're talking about. I had the good fortune many years ago to go to a talk by a man named Craig Barnes in Santa Fe, New Mexico. He was a international mediator. He was many things, but that was one of the things that he did. And he talked about how he did that kind of mediation between, well, obviously the people were willing to sit down at some point and try to resolve
right.
their conflicts, but he was working with where there had been violence, great violence. And what he said was that he always started that mediation with having both sides tell their stories to one another. So they talked about, and specifically their pain, the pain of the family members who had been killed, the pain of their sacred sites that had been destroyed, the pain of their villages that had been burned down, or whatever it was that had happened. And when he had them share, both sides share, their pain was the same. And they could begin to grow that kind of empathy. And that was the basis for resolving some of these conflicts. And I don't know how perfect it was, but there was a place for international mediation, and we need that here at home. We need that role model for when red and blue get together, or opposing social and religious and racial and gender groups get together, to really learn those deep listening skills, starting with Tell us your story. We want to hear. And there's an organization that I don't know if you're aware of, and I think there's more than one organization like this functioning now in America, not necessarily at the top of the news, but it's called the Braver Angels. And it's a grassroots movement whose whole commitment is to bring people on opposite sides of the aisle together and talk and listen. And what they find is that when they do that, exactly like Craig Barnes found when
Mm.
he did his mediation work, was that they were not all that different. We all want love. We all want safety. We all want to be able to earn a good living. We all want to feel like we belong. We all want to feel like we're valuable members of the community. None of us wants violence in our lives. And we share these things. And when people can actually take the labels off, and get outside some of the indoctrination that we've been being fed about who's right and who's bad and who's evil and who's whatever. I think most people find that we're not that different. And if and maybe people have really different views on how immigration should be handled, or really conflicting views about abortion, or really conflicting views about equal pay for equal work. Whatever they have, we will have differences of opinion and we may not come to a consensus. But in a healthy family, people don't kill each other because they disagree. They don't alienate and isolate and badmouth each other because they disagree. They don't withhold resources from them. They don't put them in jail. You know what I mean? So
Right. So, and I think that what you just said something that is really important for us to think about, and that whether it's a family or a work organization, a volunteer organization, a state or a country, which is that in a healthy family, this is how we treat each other, right?
that's
You
right.
you like the Mets and you like the Yankees. All right, we might tease each other about this, but I'll still buy you a Yankees hat for Christmas, right? So and we deal with it, right? But what's at the heart of that is that we need that kind of that vision of that's what we're aspiring for, right? We want to create that environment. And I think that right now that there is this, there's kind of a sense that maybe we don't want that environment. Maybe we want to be in conflict. Maybe we want to be having walls and we want to be having guns in a house so we can keep people away. And so that vision needs to be there first, right? That vision needs to be cursed for people. That
Yes, I mean,
like
I
you said.
think that to the extent that we want conflict and we still want to win the war, that is a symptom of dysfunctional family dynamics and unhealthy family dynamics. And maybe everybody's not going to agree, but let's educate and share with as many people as we can to try to break this cycle, because there can be a ripple effect. If one person affects another person and really has them open to the idea that we're passing on abuse and neglect dynamics on a national level, and we can expect the same results that you get from a family that's unhealed, that turns out people who, and again, not everybody who survives an abusive environment becomes either an abuser
Mhm.
or very, very passive and manipulatable, but many people do. And that's what we have to know. So, to the extent that we can provide safety, that we can provide healing, that we can provide education, that we can provide different role models of how to resolve conflict and differences, it spreads. Just
Right.
like any, like when people figured out that it was a bacteria in the water that caused a plague, there was a cure for the plague. And so the more of us that figure out that healing our human relations and committing to reconnecting with one another and valuing each other and learning to tolerate our differences without doing harm and actually seeking compromise and resolution, the more people realize that's actually in their best interest. If this, then I think the more people can get on board with that. And that's my hope for the country. That's my hope for the world, because on the longest end of the continuum of abuse dynamics and violent behavior, and the feeling that we're entitled to be violent toward people that don't agree, we have nuclear war. And we are still, funding weapons of mass destruction that could destroy all of us. And psychologically, of course, this makes no sense. None. Just
Right.
like if you had a family that was stockpiling weapons instead of feeding their children and providing them with a good education, you'd say, what's wrong with that family? What's wrong with those adults? But that's what we're doing.
Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, mutually assured destruction is not, it's not healthy, right? Yeah, we don't get to redo this experiment if we do that.
Right.
Yeah. So, Phyllis, tell us the title of your book.
Yes, it's called America in Therapy, A New Approach to Hope and Healing for a Nation in Crisis. And the whole, pretty much, I would say the second half of the book, I don't know exactly how it's divided, but the whole second half of the book is really devoted to what does the world of psychology have to offer us as individuals and as communities and as a nation that could help us reverse course and come back to the table and talk to each other and really try to work out our relationships for the benefit of everyone, because it really is for the benefit of everyone.
And as you say, this is not something that you have to necessarily be a therapist in order to learn about and model and practice in your own life.
No, absolutely not. I mean, we can all be kinder to our neighbor. We can all ask people more questions. How do you feel today? What's going on for you? Instead of just like walking away because the other person looks like they're in a bad mood. Like, how are you? Is something bothering you? Or can I help you? Or it could just be as simple as smiling. How many people don't get enough love and belonging in their lives, and they're carrying that around with them wherever they go? A lot of people. I've worked with people who have told me literally that no one ever said they loved them when they were growing up.
Wow.
This is one of the worst injuries we can sustain as human beings. So we can all be that. We can all be more informed about our collective psychology. We can all bring better human relations to our family, to our workplace, to our marriages, to our schools, and to our voting. Who are we voting for?
Exactly. So I encourage everyone to get the book, and if you want to have a conversation with Phyllis about the book, what's the best way for people to find you?
Absolutely. You can find me on my website, which is my name, www.phyllisleavitt.com, and it's PhyllisLeavitt. I'm on LinkedIn, and I have lots of videos on YouTube. And you can, but there's a contact me place on my website. And I also am offering on my website a free PDF that is all about how to apply the best elements of conflict resolution in your own life. It's called The 6 Secrets to Repairing Relationship After Conflict. And if you sign in for my newsletter, you will get that as a free gift from me, because I really want to share that with the world. And I'm also in the middle now of making a course that's how to identify your conflict type and how to move toward these two courses go together, and how to move toward implementing a change in the way you deal with conflict in your life. Because every one of us, if we deal with conflict in our own lives in a healthier, more loving, more accepting, nonviolent way, has a grassroots influence on our country. So I just say to everyone, we can all make a difference. You don't have to have a big sphere of influence. You don't have to be a governor. You can help heal human relations in your own life. And we don't know the ripple effect of that.
Yeah, that is so true, Phyllis. I mean, there are certainly times where I've had people come up to me years later and say, you said this thing to me and it really made a big difference, and I don't even remember saying it, right?
Right. Me too.
And that works both ways. It works both ways. It could be a good thing or a bad thing. So,
right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Wow. So America in Therapy. That is, yeah, check out the book, everyone. Phyllis, what would be your one piece of advice for a young person starting out?
Yeah, I know I forgot to mention one thing. You can also just email me at phyllis@phyllisleavitt.com. That's my business email.
Okay.
My one piece of advice I've sort of said, be that change in your own life. I know it sounds trite,
Yeah.
but I think for many people today really feel powerless against the rising tide of divisiveness and hatred and violence. It's terrifying every time we hear of another school shooting. I don't have, my children are grown, but I have grandchildren that attend school, and it's really scary what's happening in our country today. Whoever thought that our children wouldn't be safe in school? In the ways that they're not now. So I think a lot of people feel very powerless to change some of the bigger threats that we face in our country and in the world. And powerlessness is a very uncomfortable place to be as a human being, especially as an adult, but even for children. And so what I really encourage people is, and I've taken this advice over and over again in my own life, find a place where you do have appropriate power. We can all be better partners, parents, coworkers. We can all be better friends. Maybe you want to write a letter to the people representing you in your state. Maybe you want to write letters to the editor. Maybe you want to stand on a street corner with a sign. Maybe you just want to do your art and share joy and beautiful music or beautiful paintings with other people. Whatever you're called to do that is an appropriate way to make a contribution to the well-being of other human beings, do it. And don't judge it. You don't have to run for president. You don't have to enact new laws. If you're in a position of great influence and power, think about where you're coming from. What are you advocating? Are you advocating what you would actually want to be enacted toward you?
I love that advice, Phyllis. Especially, I get so many wonderful pieces of advice when I ask this question. A lot of it is about, how do you sort of build yourself up or achieve your own ambitions. But this advice is for the world, and I think it's really wonderful. And thank you for sharing that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Phyllis Leavitt, thank you very much for traveling with me to the edges of Lean.
And thank you for having me. It's been just wonderful talking with you. And you're clearly, making a great contribution through your podcast and the work that you're doing. So thank you.
Thank you. This is Bella Engelbach, and I would like to thank Phyllis Leavitt for joining me at the edges of Lean. What did you learn from this conversation? What are you going to do differently? What ideas did it spark? We would love to hear from you. Find Phyllis on LinkedIn and phyllisleavitt.com and find her book wherever books are sold. Please find me on LinkedIn or at leanforhumans.com. Subscribe to The Edges of Lean. There's a lot to learn. Check out all the great new Lean content at leancommunicators.com, where there's wonderful new content every week. The Edges of Lean is written and produced by Bella Engelbach with support from Podcast Inc. This is a Lean for Humans production.